Elias Thorne stands on the dusty platform of the Redemption Gulch train station, the afternoon sun beating down with an indifferent ferocity. He's a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, his face weathered by solitude and unceasing work, his eyes narrowed against the glare as the distant plume of smoke signals the approaching iron horse. He shifts his weight from one worn boot to the other, the cheap paper detailing the mail-order bride agency's particulars crinkling in his sweat-dampened shirt pocket. He doesn't know what to expect, only that he paid good money, money he could ill afford, for a companion, a helper, someone to break the crushing silence that had become the soundtrack of his isolated ranch. He'd asked for someone plain, hard-working and willing. The photograph, a smudged and blurry affair, had shown a woman with a solemn face, which he'd taken for seriousness of purpose. The train groans to a halt, its arrival heralded by a hiss of steam and the shriek of tortured metal. A few passengers disembark, blinking in the harsh light. Then a woman descends, her movements hesitant, almost furtive. She's young, perhaps 19 or 20, clutching a single battered carpet bag as if it were her only anchor in a hostile world. Her eyes, large and shadowed with a weariness that went beyond mere travel fatigue, dart around the small platform, flinching at every sudden sound, as if expecting a blow or a shouted accusation. Her dress is dark, practical, but rumpled and coated with the dust of a long journey. This must be her, Eliza Miller, according to the correspondence. Before Elias can compose his features into something resembling a welcome, or even find his voice to greet her, another figure emerges from the same carriage, blocking her momentarily from view. A tall man, broad-shouldered, his duster swept back to reveal the glint of a tin star pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal. His gaze, cold and devoid of any warmth, sweeps the platform and then fixes, with unnerving precision, on the young woman. Abigail Trent, the Marshal's voice cuts through the station's desultory quiet, sharp as a whip crack. You're a hard woman to find. The woman, Abigail Trent, not Eliza Miller, flinches as if struck. Her face, already pale, loses its last vestige of color, leaving her looking stark and desperately vulnerable. Elias freezes mid-step, the crinkled paper in his pocket suddenly feeling like a brand against his skin. This wasn't what he bargained for. This wasn't in any of the careful, stilted letters. His mail-order bride, bought and paid for, sight unseen beyond that poor excuse for a likeness, had arrived with the full weight of the law on her trail. There's more to this woman than meets the eye. Before her true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The Marshal took a deliberate step towards her, his hand resting near the Colt at his hip. You'll be coming with me, quietly, if you know what's good for you. Elias finally found his voice, rough from disuse and the shock of the moment. Hold on there, Marshal. He moved to stand slightly between the lawman and the terrified woman. This here is Miss Eliza Miller. She's my intended. The words felt foreign on his tongue, a lie stumbled into out of some instinct he didn't understand. The Marshal's lip curled into a sneer. Miller, Trent, it's all the same to the gallows, or near enough to make no difference. I'm Marshal Clayton, and this woman is wanted for grand larceny back in Missouri. Step aside, mister. This ain't your concern. Elias looked from the grim-faced, confident lawman to the young woman who seemed to shrink under their combined scrutiny, her knuckles white where she gripped her bag. A muscle worked in his jaw. He'd sent for a wife, a companion, not a fugitive. His first instinct was to wash his hands of the whole sorry mess, to let the law take its course. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But something in her wide, desperate eyes, something that looked more like terror than hardened criminality, gave him pause. He made a choice then, sudden and irreversible, a spark of old defiance he hadn't felt in years, not since Martha. She's on my land now, Marshal, he stated, his voice low but carrying a new, firm timbre, or will be, soon as she steps off this platform with me. And she'll be under my protection until I hear a damn sight more than your word for it, and maybe not even then. And with that, Elias Thorne's carefully constructed, solitary life shattered, and a whole new, unwelcome brand of trouble had just ridden into town on the afternoon train. Marshal Clayton's eyes narrowed, glinting with surprised anger. You harboring a fugitive, mister? Thorne, Elias Thorne, and I'm harboring no one. I'm meeting my bride. He held the marshal's gaze, a stubborn set to his jaw. He didn't know why he was doing this, risking involvement in God knew what, but the sight of the woman's stark fear had tripped a wire in him. You got a warrant for Eliza Miller? I got a warrant for Abigail Trent, Clayton snapped, and she fits the description. Don't play games with me, Thorne. Obstructing a federal officer is a serious offense. I ain't obstructing, I'm stating my claim. She came here to marry me. Until a judge says otherwise, she's my responsibility. Elias was improvising, drawing on a well of obstinacy he'd forgotten he possessed. He glanced at the woman. You Eliza Miller? He asked, his tone softer than it had been with the marshal. She swallowed, her gaze flickering between the two men. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eliza Miller. Her eyes pleaded with him, a desperate, silent appeal. Elias nodded curtly. Then let's go, Miss Miller. My wagon's over yonder. He gestured with his chin, deliberately turning his back slightly on the marshal, a clear dismissal. He didn't offer to take her bag. His hands were still clenched from the confrontation. Clayton seethed, but Elias had called his bluff, at least for the moment. Without a local warrant specifying this new name, in a town where Thorne was at least a known, if solitary, quantity, dragging her away physically in front of witnesses could get complicated. This isn't over, Thorne, Clayton bit out, his voice laden with threat. I'll be seeing you, and her. He gave the woman one last, hard look. Count on it. He then turned on his heel and strode towards the small building that served as Redemption Gulch's telegraph office and unofficial sheriff's post. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to the woman, Eliza or Abigail, or whoever she truly was. She looked as if she might collapse. Come on, he said, his voice still gruff to hide the turmoil inside him. Best we move. The journey to his ranch was made in almost complete silence. The wagon jolted over the rutted track, kicking up dust that coated them both. Elias's spread was a good 5 miles out of Redemption Gulch, isolated even by the standards of the territory. The land was harsh, rocky, sun-baked, with stubborn patches of scrub and lonely, twisted junipers. It was land that demanded everything a man had and gave back just enough to keep him tied to it. He'd inherited it from his father, worked it alone for the past 10 years, since Martha and little Samuel were taken by the fever. The silence of the place had become a living thing, sometimes a comfort, often a torment. He'd hoped a wife would change that, bring a different kind of sound, a human warmth. He hadn't anticipated this kind of clamor, this loud, invisible threat that now sat beside him. Eliza, he'd call her Eliza for now, sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she could will herself to disappear into it. She was small-boned, and the journey had clearly exhausted her. He stole glances at her profile. Her features were delicate, her jawline showing a hint of stubbornness that perhaps matched his own, though fear was the dominant expression. She wasn't plain, not really. The photograph hadn't done her justice, or perhaps desperation had lent her a fragile beauty. As they passed the last turnoff that led to any other homestead, the already sparse signs of civilization vanished. The only eyes on them now were those of the circling buzzards high overhead, and perhaps, in Elias's imagination, the lingering, condemnatory gaze of Marshal Clayton. He saw a flicker of movement at the edge of a stand of cottonwoods near the creek, probably just deer, but his nerves were raw. He imagined the townsfolk, what few there were in Redemption Gulch's single dusty street, were already buzzing. Saw Thorne take that woman Marshal Clayton was after, they'd be saying. Always knew Thorne was a strange one. His reputation, such as it was, for being a quiet mind, his own businessman, was likely ruined. The cabin, when it finally came into view, was small and unadorned, built of rough-hewn logs, with a lean-to kitchen added as an afterthought. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. He'd left a low fire in the stove. It was a stark, utilitarian place, offering little in the way of comfort beyond basic shelter. He wondered what she made of it, this woman who was supposedly running from grand larceny. It was hardly the sort of place one fled to for a life of ease. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. "We're here," he announced unnecessarily. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the wagon springs and the distant caw of a crow. Eliza slowly turned her head, her eyes taking in the cabin, the dusty yard, the endless, empty land stretching away in every direction. He couldn't read her expression. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resignation? Or was it a flicker of something akin to relief at having finally stopped running, if only for a moment? "It's Kate," she said, her voice husky. "It is that," Elias agreed. He climbed down from the wagon, his joints stiff. "I'll take your bag." This time he made the offer. She allowed him to take the carpet bag, her fingers brushing his briefly. Her hand was cold. Inside, the cabin was Spartan. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner covered with a faded quilt, and a smaller cot in the other. A few shelves held meager supplies. It was clean, though, meticulously so. Martha had taught him that much. "The cot's yours," he said, gesturing. "I'll take the bed. For now." The implication hung in the air. They were supposed to be bride and groom. This arrangement was already a sham, complicated by a federal marshal. "There's water in the bucket. Outhouse is round back." She nodded, her eyes darting around the small space, taking it all in. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if ready to bolt at any second. He felt a strange mixture of resentment and a reluctant sympathy. He'd been duped, that much was clear. He'd paid for a wife, Eliza Miller, and gotten Abigail Trent, a fugitive. Yet, looking at her, she seemed more hunted than predatory. "You hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. She shook her head, then hesitated. "A little, maybe. Some water would be good." He ladled some water from the bucket into a tin cup and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. She drank it down quickly, as if she hadn't tasted water in days. "Marshal Clayton," she said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the cup in her hands. He said, "Grand larceny." Elias leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "That what you're running from?" She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and dark. "It's not true. Not the way he means it. I never stole anything, not really. Not in my heart." "The law don't much care about what's in your heart, Miss Trent," Elias said, his voice flat. "Or Miss Miller, whichever you prefer." "Eliza," she whispered. "Please, Eliza." "All right, Eliza, but Clayton will be back. He's not the type to give up easy. He'll be checking telegraphs, getting papers sent. What then?" Her shoulders slumped. "I don't know. I had to get away from where I was. I saw the advertisement. It seemed like a chance. A new start, where no one knew me." "Some start," Elias muttered, more to himself than her. He pushed himself away from the doorframe. "I've got chores. You can, rest, or make yourself useful. Suit yourself." He didn't want to be unkind, but he felt off balance, angry at the deception, yet unwilling to simply throw her to the wolves. Not yet. He left her then, striding out towards the barn, needing the familiar rhythm of work to clear his head. The sun was beginning to dip towards the western hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, lonely land, and now it held another lonely, frightened soul. He wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The next day, Marshal Clayton made good on his promise. He rode out to the ranch mid-morning, not alone this time, but with Deputy Miller from Redemption Gulch, a portly, nervous man who clearly wished he were anywhere else. Elias saw them coming from a long way off, a telltale plume of dust rising against the clear sky. He was mending a section of fence by the creek, Eliza a short distance away, ostensibly gathering kindling but mostly just watching the tree line with an air of constant apprehension. "Company," Elias said quietly, not looking at her. Eliza froze, her eyes wide with renewed terror. She dropped the few sticks she'd collected. "Go inside," Elias told her. "Stay there, don't come out, no matter what you hear." She nodded, her face ashen, and practically ran towards the cabin, disappearing inside. Elias straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and waited. He leaned on the fence post, projecting an air of calm he didn't feel. Clayton and Miller reined in a few yards away. "Thorne," Clayton greeted him, his voice curt. "Brought Deputy Miller along. Figured you might be more inclined to listen to local law." Elias just nodded at Miller, who gave a weak, uncomfortable smile. "Marshal, deputy, something I can do for you." "You can hand over Abigail Trent," Clayton said, his patience clearly thin. "I've telegraphed my superiors. Confirmation of her warrant is on its way. She's accused of stealing a significant amount of jewelry and bonds from her former employers, the Hemlock family back in St. Louis. Prominent people, Thorne. Not the kind to let things slide." Elias absorbed this. St. Louis. Prominent family. It sounded more serious than he'd hoped. "She told me her name is Eliza Miller, and she told me she didn't steal anything." Clayton scoffed. "Of course she did. What thief admits it? Look, Thorne, I can appreciate a man wanting to protect what he thinks is his, but you're way out of your depth here. These Hemlocks have influence. They want her back. You stand in the way, you'll find yourself in a heap of trouble." "She your wife yet, Thorne?" Deputy Miller asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Parson Billups was through here last month. Could have tied the knot then, if you were quick about it." He seemed to be offering Elias an out, a legal loophole. Elias considered it. "Not yet, Deputy. We were getting acquainted." "Then she ain't legally yourn to protect. Not in that way," Clayton pressed. "I'm giving you one last chance. Send her out." He glanced towards the cabin. He saw a flicker of movement at the small, grimy window. Eliza, watching. Clayton's eyes narrowed. "She has a distinctive locket," he said, almost to himself, then louder to Elias. "A silver filigree locket, shaped like a heart. The Hemlocks reported it missing along with the other items. A family heirloom. You seen her with anything like that?" Elias's mind flashed back to the previous evening. After a meager supper eaten in near silence, Eliza had been sitting on the cot, her back to him, and he'd seen her clutch something at her throat. A brief glint of silver before she tucked it back into the collar of her dress. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Now, Clayton's words struck him like a physical blow. A silver locket. Could it be that simple? Was she just a common thief after all? His silence seemed to confirm something for Clayton. "I thought so," the Marshal said with grim satisfaction. "She's in there, isn't she? I'm coming in to get her." Elias straightened, his hand falling to rest on the handle of the axe he'd been using for the fence posts. It wasn't a conscious threat, more an instinctual bracing. "You're not setting foot in my cabin, Marshal. Not without a warrant from a circuit judge with her name, Eliza Miller or Abigail Trent, on it, and specific to this territory. Your St. Plies, in Giles, for Vazis. Louis paper might be fine back there, but out here, things are different. You know the law." He was banking on Clayton not having gone through all the proper territorial channels yet, hoping the Marshal was relying on bluster and intimidation. Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably. "He's got a point, Marshal. Territorial jurisdiction, it can be sticky." Clayton glared at the deputy, then back at Elias. "You're a fool, Thorne. A stubborn, pig-headed fool. You're harboring a criminal. When that telegraph comes through with the full authority, I'll be back, and I won't be so polite." He wheeled his horse around. "Come on, Miller. Let this jackass stew in his own trouble." The two lawmen rode off, leaving Elias standing by the fence, the axe handle still cool in his grip. The locket. He had to know. He walked slowly back to the cabin. Eliza was standing just inside the door, her face pale, her eyes searching his. "What did he say?" she whispered. "He said you stole jewelry, bonds, from a family called Hemlock in St. Louis. Said they're important people." He watched her face carefully. He also mentioned a locket, silver, heart-shaped. Her hand flew to her throat, protectively. Color flooded her cheeks, then drained away again, leaving her looking even more wretched. She didn't deny it. "Let me see it," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. Hesitantly, her fingers trembling, she fumbled at her collar and drew out a fine silver chain. Suspended from it was a small, intricately worked silver locket, indeed shaped like a heart. It was clearly old and valuable. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. So Clayton was right. She was a thief, and he, Elias Thorne, was a damn fool. "They gave it to me," she said, her voice barely a breath. "Mrs. Hemlock did, for my birthday last spring, before everything changed." Elias looked from the locket to her tear-filled eyes. "Why didn't you tell me? About St. Louis, the Hemlocks, about this?" I was scared, she choked out. I thought if you knew, you'd turn me over to him straight away. I didn't steal from them, Elias. Not the things he says. Mr. Hemlock, she faltered, shame and fear warring on her face. He wasn't a good man. He tried to force himself on me. I fought him off. His wife, Mrs. Hemlock, she walked in. She didn't believe me, or she chose not to. He told her I'd tried to seduce him, and when he spurned me, I tried to steal from them. They concocted the story about the jewels and bonds to ruin me, to punish me for rejecting him, and for Mrs. Hemlock finding out about his nature. Her voice broke. I ran. I had to. They would have seen me hanged or worse. Elias listened, his expression unreadable. It was a plausible story, the kind of ugly tale that often played out between the powerful and the vulnerable. But it was also the kind of story a clever thief might invent. He wanted to believe her. Looking at her, small and wretched, the expensive locket a stark contrast to her worn dress, he found he did. Or at least, he wanted to enough to keep fighting for now. Clayton will use that locket as proof, he said heavily. He'll say you were caught red-handed with stolen goods. But it was a gift, she insisted, tears streaming down her face now. She gave it to me in front of her own sister. Her sister, Clara, she saw it. This Clara, Elias said, seizing on the detail. Where is she? Eliza shook her head despairingly. I don't know. She lived in a different town, and even if I knew, how could I reach her? How could she help me against the Hemlocks? Elias was silent for a long moment. He was in deep now, far deeper than he'd ever intended. He'd bought a mail-order bride and inherited a hornet's nest. His quiet life was gone, replaced by secrets, lies, and the looming threat of Marshal Clayton. He looked at Eliza, at the genuine despair in her eyes. He'd made a stand at the train station, a second one just now. He couldn't back down, not yet. All right, he said finally, his voice rough. All right, Eliza, we'll figure something out. He didn't know what that something was, but he'd said it. He was committed. He walked past her, into the dim cabin, the weight of her troubles settling onto his own broad shoulders. The locket might be a noose, or it might be the one thing that could save her, if her story about the witness, Clara, was true. But finding Clara was a needle in a haystack, and time was running out. The days that followed settled into a tense routine. Elias worked his land with a grim determination, acutely aware of Eliza's watchful presence. She tried to make herself useful, learning the rhythms of the ranch with a surprising quickness. She helped with the chickens, tended the small vegetable patch he'd neglected since Martha died, and even learned to milk the cantankerous old cow, Bess. She was a quiet presence, often lost in her own troubled thoughts, but she was also observant and intelligent. She mended his work shirts without being asked, her stitches neat and small. She learned to bake a passable cornbread in the old stove. Slowly, tentatively, the cabin began to feel less like a stark shelter and more like a shared space, albeit one thick with unspoken fears. Elias found himself watching her. He noted the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was learning a new task, the rare, fleeting smile that touched her lips when one of the barn kittens rubbed against her ankles, the haunted look that came into her eyes whenever a rider appeared in the distance. He saw not a hardened criminal, but a young woman fighting for her life, burdened by a secret she couldn't share and a past she couldn't escape. His initial resentment at being deceived began to fade, replaced by a reluctant admiration for her resilience and a growing, fiercely protective instinct. They spoke little of Marshal Clayton, but his threat hung over them constantly. Elias knew the Marshal would be working, gathering his proofs, preparing to return. Each sunset felt like a reprieve, each sunrise a fresh wave of anxiety. Eliza rarely mentioned her past in St. Louis, but sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the sigh of the wind in the eaves, she would let slip small details, a memory of a kind teacher, a favorite book, a description of the gardens where she used to walk. These fragments painted a picture of a life abruptly shattered, of a girl who had known books and gardens, not just hardship and fear. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing a broken harness in the barn, Eliza approached him, her hands twisting in her apron. Elias, she began, her voice hesitant, I've been thinking about what you said, about Marshal Clayton coming back. He stopped his work, looking at her. "I? It's not fair to you," she said, her gaze fixed on the dusty floor. "This trouble, it's mine. You shouldn't have to risk yourself, your ranch for me. Maybe I should just go. Give myself up. It might be easier for everyone." Elias frowned, putting down the harness. "Easier for who, Eliza? For Clayton? For those Hemlocks? You think they'll give you a fair hearing if you walk back into their clutches?" He shook his head. "You told me your story. I believe you, or I choose to believe you. We don't run. We don't give up." Her eyes welled with tears. "But why? Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me." He looked away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion in her voice, in her eyes. "I made a bargain," he said gruffly. "Sent for a wife. You answered. That makes you my responsibility for now. Besides," he added, a wry twist to his lips, "life out here was getting a mite too quiet. A little trouble livens things up." She saw through his attempt at lightness. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "You're a good man, Elias Thorne." He just grunted and picked up the harness again, but her words warmed something inside him that had been cold for a long time. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. Elias had ridden into Redemption Gulch for essential supplies, leaving Eliza at the ranch with strict instructions to stay hidden and alert. The town felt different. Eyes followed him. Whispers ceased as he passed. He saw Marshal Clayton standing outside the telegraph office, talking with a couple of hard-looking men Elias didn't recognize. Bounty hunters likely, drawn by the scent of trouble and reward. Clayton saw him, and a predatory gleam lit his eyes. He didn't approach Elias, just watched him with an unnerving confidence. Elias completed his business as quickly as possible, his gut churning with unease. As he was loading his supplies onto the wagon, the telegraph clerk, a nervous young man named Peters, hurried over to him. "Mr. Thorne," Peters said, his voice low and urgent. "A message came through for Marshal Clayton from St. Louis. I happened to see it." He glanced around nervously. "It's an official warrant, sir, for Abigail Trent, signed by a federal judge, and there's more. The Hemlocks have put up a substantial reward for her capture." Elias felt a chill despite the midday heat. "Thank you for telling me, Peters." "Be careful, Mr. Thorne," Peters whispered, then scurried back to the safety of his office. Elias drove the wagon out of town like a man pursued by demons. The warrant, the reward. Clayton would be coming, and this time he'd have all the authority he needed. And with bounty hunters in the mix, things could get ugly, fast. He had to warn Eliza. They had to decide what to do. Running seemed like the only option now, but where could they go that the long arm of the Hemlocks and the persistence of men like Clayton wouldn't reach? When he reached the ranch, he found Eliza white-faced and trembling. "Two men," she whispered, as soon as he entered the cabin. "They rode by not an hour ago. They didn't stop, but they looked. They looked hard at the cabin. I hid." Bounty hunters. Clayton was already closing the net. "Pack what you can," Elias said, his voice grim. "Just the essentials. We're leaving." "Where will we go?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "North, maybe. Into the mountains. Somewhere we can lose them. But we have to move now. Clayton has the warrant, and he's got help." As they hastily gathered a few provisions, some dried meat, flour, coffee, his rifle and ammunition, a bedroll, Elias's mind raced. Running felt like a defeat. It felt like admitting her guilt. There had to be another way. That sister, Clara. If they could find her, but how? Suddenly, Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The letter," she whispered. "I wrote a letter." "Letter? To who?" "To Clara, Mrs. Hemlock's sister. Just before I fled St. Louis. I told her everything that happened, about Mr. Hemlock. I begged her to believe me. I sent it to her last known address in a little town called Harmony Creek. I don't even know if she got it." Elias seized on the information. "Harmony Creek. Do you remember the state?" I think it was in Kansas," she said uncertainly. "But it was months ago. She might have moved." "Kansas. A long way. But it was something. A slim chance, but better than none." "All right," Elias said, his mind made up. "New plan. We're not just running. We're going to Harmony Creek, Kansas." We're going to find Clara. It was a wild gamble, a desperate shot in the dark, but it was a plan of action, not just flight. Their journey was fraught with peril. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding main roads, sticking to hidden trails and creek beds. Elias, with his knowledge of the land, was a good guide, but the constant fear of pursuit wore them both down. Eliza, despite her fear, proved to be remarkably resilient. She never complained, bore the hardship stoically, and even managed to find moments of quiet beauty in the harsh landscape. Elias found his admiration for her growing with each passing day. This was no pampered city girl, no common thief. This was a woman of courage and hidden strength. He taught her to handle a small pistol he kept, just in case. She learned quickly, her determination fierce. They shared meager meals cooked over small, smokeless fires, and slept fitfully under the vast, star-studded sky, always with one ear cocked for the sound of approaching hooves. During those long, quiet nights, they talked more than they ever had at the ranch. Eliza spoke of her childhood, of her love for books, of her dreams of becoming a teacher. Elias, in turn, found himself speaking of Martha and Samuel, of the loneliness that had consumed him for so long. A bond was forming between them, forged in shared adversity and a dawning, unspoken affection. One evening, camped in a sheltered ravine, Eliza was cleaning the pistol Elias had given her, her movements precise. "Elias," she said softly, not looking up, if we don't find Clara, or if she can't help, what then?" Elias stared into the small fire. "Then we keep going. We'll find somewhere safe, make a new life." He said it with more confidence than he felt. She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You mean, we?" He met her gaze. "I, Eliza, we." A small, tremulous smile touched her lips. It was the first time he'd seen a genuine glimmer of hope in her eyes since she'd stepped off that train. After nearly 3 weeks of hard travel, evading patrols and bounty hunters who were undoubtedly combing the territories for them, they finally crossed into Kansas. Harmony Creek, according to a tattered map Elias had, was another 2 days' ride. Their supplies were dwindling, their horses exhausted, but a fragile hope spurred them on. They found Harmony Creek nestled in a shallow valley, a small, sleepy town that seemed a world away from the harshness of the Arizona territory. Their inquiries about Clara, whose married name Eliza remembered as Clara Bellwether, led them to a small, neat house on the edge of town. A kind-faced woman in her late 40s, with eyes that held a hint of sadness, answered the door. It was Clara. When Eliza introduced herself, Clara Bellwether's eyes widened in recognition, then filled with a mixture of shock and compassion. "Abigail Trent, my dear girl, I received your letter. I was horrified. I knew my brother-in-law was a difficult man, but I never imagined." She ushered them inside, her voice trembling slightly. Over cups of tea, Eliza recounted her story again, Elias sitting quietly by her side, his presence a steady reassurance. Clara listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each word. "I believed you, Abigail," Clara said when Eliza had finished. "Your letter, it had the ring of truth, and I know my sister, Eleanor, she worships Horace Hemlock blindly. She would believe anything he told her, especially if it protected her own pride." "The locket," Eliza said, her voice pleading. "You were there when she gave it to me. You saw her." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember. It was your 19th birthday. Eleanor was in a generous mood that day. She made quite a show of giving it to you." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "But Abigail, Horace and Eleanor are powerful. My word against theirs, it might not be enough. They could ruin me too." Elias spoke then, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Bellwether, all we're asking is for you to tell the truth. If Marshal Clayton or any lawman questions you, just tell them what you saw, what you know. Eliza isn't asking you to fight her battles, just to corroborate that one piece of her story. The locket wasn't stolen, it was a gift." Clara looked from Elias to Eliza, her gaze lingering on the young woman's earnest, hopeful face. She saw the toll the ordeal had taken on her. She sighed, a deep, weary sound. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it. I'll write an affidavit, get it notarized by our local magistrate, and if anyone comes asking, I will tell them the truth. It's the least I can do. Eleanor, She's my sister, but she's wrong in this. Relief washed over Eliza in a palpable wave. She reached across the table and grasped Clara's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." With Clara Bellwether's notarized affidavit in hand, a small but crucial piece of evidence, Elias and Eliza felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't a guarantee of freedom, but it was a weapon. They decided their best course was not to hide any longer, but to face Clayton, to find a circuit judge in a larger town, and present their case. Hiding forever was no life. They traveled towards Wichita, a major stop for circuit judges. Elias knew it was a risk. Clayton might be there, or word of their whereabouts might reach him, but it was a risk they had to take. As they neared the town, Elias made a decision. "Eliza," he said one evening as they made camp, This arrangement between us, it started as a lie, a way to protect you at the station, but it doesn't feel like a lie anymore." He fumbled for words, unaccustomed to expressing his feelings. "What I mean to say is, if we get through this, I'd be honored if you'd consent to be my wife, for real, Eliza Miller Thorne, or Abigail Trent Thorne, whichever name you choose to live by." Eliza stared at him, her eyes wide, luminous in the firelight. Tears welled, but this time they were not tears of fear or sorrow. "Oh, Elias," she whispered. Yes, I will." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. It was a proposal made under the shadow of the gallows, perhaps, but it was heartfelt and true. They found a preacher in a small settlement just outside Wichita, a kindly old man who, after hearing a carefully edited version of their story, agreed to marry them. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the preacher's humble parlor, with his wife and son as witnesses. When Elias slipped a plain gold band, one he'd bought in a pawn shop years ago, thinking of Martha, but never able to part with until now, onto Eliza's finger, it felt like the sealing of a sacred vow. She was his wife now, in name and in heart. Wichita was bustling, a stark contrast to the isolation they'd grown accustomed to. Elias learned that a circuit judge, Judge Harrison, known for his stern but fair demeanor, was indeed holding court. He also learned with a sinking heart that Marshal Clayton had been seen in town, asking questions. The confrontation was inevitable. It came the next morning, on the steps of the temporary courthouse. As Elias and Eliza approached, Clayton, flanked by 2 local deputies, stepped out to block their path. "Abigail Trent," Clayton said, his voice triumphant. "Or should I say, Mrs. Thorne, I heard you found a preacher foolish enough to marry you. It won't help. I have a federal warrant. You're under arrest." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Clayton and Eliza. "Marshal, this is my wife, Eliza Thorne, and we've come to see Judge Harrison. We have evidence that will prove her innocence regarding that locket." "Evidence?" Clayton sneered. "What evidence could a lying thief and a love-struck fool possibly have?" Just then, Judge Harrison himself emerged from the courthouse, a tall, imposing figure with a no-nonsense air. "What is the meaning of this commotion, Marshal?" he asked, his voice booming. Clayton, momentarily flustered, straightened. "Your Honor, this is Abigail Trent, a fugitive from St. Louis, wanted for grand larceny. I have a warrant for her arrest." He produced the document. Judge Harrison took the warrant, his eyes scanning it. "And this woman?" He gestured to Eliza. "She claims her name is Eliza Thorne, says she's married to this man," Clayton said, nodding dismissively at Elias. "A recent, convenient marriage, no doubt." "We are married, Your Honor," Elias said firmly, "and my wife is innocent of these charges. The primary item she is accused of stealing, a silver locket, was a gift. We have a notarized affidavit from Mrs. Clara Bellwether of Harmony Creek, Kansas, sister of Mrs. Hemlock, who witnessed the locket being given to my wife." He produced Clara's carefully folded document. Judge Harrison took the affidavit, his expression unreadable as he read it. Clayton looked momentarily stunned, then scoffed. "A piece of paper from a relative, that proves nothing." "It proves, Marshal," the judge said, his voice sharp, "that there is conflicting testimony regarding a key piece of your alleged evidence. Mrs. Resold B.Art. 2CEO.coms. Hemlock claims it was stolen. Her own sister claims it was a gift. This casts considerable doubt on the assertion that Miss Trent, or Mrs. Thorne, absconded with stolen property, at least concerning this locket. What other direct evidence do you have of this grand larceny? Bills of sale for the other allegedly stolen items? Witnesses who saw her take them? Clayton stammered. The Hemlocks are respected citizens. Their word. The word of respected citizens is valuable, Marshal, Judge Harrison interrupted, but it is not in itself irrefutable proof, especially when challenged by other credible testimony. You are pursuing this woman across territories based on an accusation. While the warrant appears valid on its face for Abigail Trent, the circumstances you describe, and this affidavit, suggest this matter is more complex than simple theft. Eliza, emboldened by Elias's strength and the judge's measured tone, stepped forward. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and steady despite her trembling, I did not steal from the Hemlocks. Mr. Hemlock made unwelcome advances towards me. When I rebuffed him, and his wife nearly discovered his behavior, they concocted this story to punish me and protect his reputation. I fled because I knew I would not receive justice in St. Louis, where they are powerful and I am nobody. All I ask is a chance to clear my name. Judge Harrison looked from Eliza's earnest face to Elias's resolute stance, then to Marshal Clayton's frustrated anger. Marshal Clayton, he said finally, you may have a warrant from another jurisdiction, but in my court in this territory, I see a woman who has made a plausible claim of innocence, supported by at least one piece of corroborating evidence, however circumstantial. I also see a woman who has since married a resident of this territory. While I cannot dismiss your warrant outright, I am not inclined to see Mrs. Thorne incarcerated based solely on the Hemlock's accusation and your pursuit, especially given this new testimony concerning the locket. If the Hemlocks wish to pursue charges of theft for other items, they will need to provide substantial, verifiable evidence to the authorities in this jurisdiction or pursue formal extradition proceedings, which will be subject to scrutiny. For now, Mrs. Thorne, he said, turning to Eliza, you are free to go with your husband. Marshal, I suggest you confine your activities to legitimate, evidence-based law enforcement, not personal vendettas or pursuits on behalf of influential accusers without due diligence. Clayton was livid, his face flushed with fury, but he was powerless against the judge's ruling. He glared at Elias and Eliza, a look of pure venom. This isn't over, he hissed, but his threat lacked its former power. He had been publicly rebuked. Elias met his gaze steadily. It is for today, Marshal. He took Eliza's arm. Come, wife. They turned and walked away from the courthouse, leaving Marshal Clayton fuming on the steps. The eyes of the onlookers were no longer accusatory, but curious, some even sympathetic. As they rode away from Wichita later that day, a profound silence enveloped them, the kind that follows a storm. Eliza finally let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders slumping in relief. Elias reached across the small space between their horses and took her hand, his fingers closing reassuringly around hers. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but also with a light he hadn't seen before, a light of hope, of gratitude, of love. The legal threat wasn't entirely vanquished. The Hemlocks were wealthy and vindictive, but for now they had won. They had faced the dragon and, if not slain it, had at least driven it back. We should head back to the ranch, Elias said, his voice husky. There's planting to be done. Eliza smiled, a true radiant smile that transformed her face. Yes, she said, our ranch. The journey back to Arizona territory was different. The fear was lessened, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph and a deepening affection. They were no longer fugitives, but husband and wife, returning home. The cabin, when they finally reached it after many weeks, no longer felt like a temporary shelter or a prison. It felt like a sanctuary, a place of their own making. Elias watched Eliza as she moved about the small space, a newfound lightness in her step, humming a soft tune as she unpacked their meager belongings. The afternoon sun streamed through the open doorway, catching the gold in her hair. He remembered the frightened, desperate woman who had stepped off the train with a marshal on her trail. He hadn't known then what he was getting into, only that he'd bought a mail-order bride, sight unseen. He had received far more than he bargained for. He hadn't just found a helper or a companion to break the silence. He'd found a woman of extraordinary courage and quiet strength. He'd found his wife. He'd found his heart, buried deep beneath years of solitude and sorrow. He crossed the room and took her hand, drawing her gently towards him. She looked up at him, her eyes soft and questioning. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He simply leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of trust hard won, and of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The vast, silent landscape outside seemed to embrace them, holding their small cabin and their intertwined lives in a promise of hard-won peace and a future they would build together, side by side. The door of the cabin is open to the afternoon sun, a gentle breeze rustling the cottonwood leaves nearby. Elias Thorne watches his wife, Eliza, as she kneels by a small patch of earth beside the porch, carefully tending to a few resilient tomato plants that are just beginning to show fruit. There's a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and her hair, the color of ripe wheat, has come loose from its pins, but her face is serene, a quiet contentment having replaced the fear that once haunted her eyes. He thinks back to that day at the station, the dust, the marshal, the sheer, unexpected chaos of her arrival. He had sent for a solution to his loneliness, a practical arrangement. He had received a fugitive, a mystery, and ultimately, a love he never thought to find again. She looks up, sensing his gaze, and offers him a small, genuine smile, a smile that still makes his heart stumble. He returns it, a slow warmth spreading through him. They have their peace, hard-won and precious, here on their small piece of land. The shadows of the past may linger, but they no longer hold dominion. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.